Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. What would it feel like to wake up one autumn morning and discover that the food your family had depended on for generations was quietly disappearing beneath the soil, not taken by war or drought, not destroyed by a visible storm, but simply turning to rot underground before anyone could harvest it? For millions of people in 19th century Ireland, that quiet and unsettling discovery would begin a chain of events that reshaped an entire nation and scattered its people across the world. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in tonight, feel free to share your location and the local time where you're listening from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the middle of the 19th century, Ireland was a land where everyday life moved at a slow and familiar rhythm. Villages were small, roads were rough, and most people lived close to the fields they worked. The majority of the population lived in rural cottages scattered across farmland that stretched over rolling hills and damp valleys. Families often worked the same plots of land their parents and grandparents had worked before them. Life was not easy, but it followed a pattern that people understood. For generations, the foundation of that daily life had been a single crop, the potato. The potato had arrived in Ireland centuries earlier, brought from the Americas through the expanding trade networks of Europe. Over time, it proved to be remarkably well suited to the Irish climate. Ireland's cool temperatures and frequent rain created ideal conditions for the crop. Potatoes could grow in soil that was too poor for many other foods. They produced large yields from small plots of land. Most importantly, they contained enough nutrients to sustain a family when combined with a small amount of milk. By the early 1800s, potatoes had become deeply woven into Irish rural life. A typical farming family could plant a small patch near their cottage and harvest enough food to feed several people throughout the year. Even families with very little land could survive if their potato crop remained healthy. At the same time, Ireland's population had been growing rapidly. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, improvements in agriculture and public health had allowed more people to survive into adulthood. Families were often large. Villages that had once been quiet clusters of cottages slowly expanded into dense rural communities. By the 1840s, the population of Ireland had reached more than 8 million people, making it one of the most densely populated regions in Europe. Yet beneath this growing population was a fragile economic structure. Much of the land in Ireland was owned by landlords who often lived elsewhere, sometimes even outside the country. Many were members of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy, part of a social system that had developed during centuries of British rule. These landlords typically rented their land to tenant farmers. In many cases, the tenants did not own the soil they worked. Instead, they paid rent for small plots, sometimes only a few acres in size. If a family failed to pay rent, they could lose the land entirely. Over time, farms became increasingly divided into smaller and smaller holdings as land passed from one generation to the next. A single property might eventually be divided among several families. This created many tiny farms that were barely large enough to support a household. In these small fields, potatoes became the most reliable source of food. Grain crops like wheat or oats were often grown as well, but these were frequently sold to pay rent. The potato patch near the cottage remained the main source of daily meals. During a typical year, the cycle of planting and harvesting followed a predictable pattern. In the spring, families planted seed potatoes in rows across their small plots. Through the summer months, the plants grew thick green leaves that spread across the fields. By autumn, the crop was ready to dig from the soil. When harvest time arrived, families gathered in the fields to lift the potatoes from the ground. Baskets and sacks were filled with the year's food supply. Some potatoes were stored in small pits lined with straw to protect them from winter frost. Others were kept inside cottages or simple storage sheds. For many families, this harvest meant security for the months ahead. But in the summer of 1845, something unusual began appearing in potato fields across parts of Ireland. Farmers first noticed dark patches forming on the leaves of the plants. At first, these marks seemed small and easy to ignore. Leaves sometimes showed signs of disease or damage from weather. Most people assumed it was a minor problem. Within days, however, the patches spread across entire fields. Leaves began to turn black and collapse. When farmers dug into the soil to inspect the potatoes themselves, they found something even more troubling. The potatoes were rotting. What had looked healthy from the surface often turned soft and dark when pulled from the ground. Some gave off a sour smell as they decayed. A crop that had promised a full harvest was suddenly useless. The disease responsible for this destruction was a fungus-like organism known today as Phytophthora infestans. At the time, however, people did not understand what was happening. The science of plant diseases was still in its early stages. Many farmers simply referred to the problem as the blight. News of the ruined crops spread quickly from one region to another. Fields that had looked promising one week could be destroyed the next. Rain and wind helped carry the disease across the countryside. The blight did not arrive everywhere at the same moment. Some areas saw damage earlier than others. In certain counties, the harvest was only partially affected during that first year, but the warning signs were clear. Across Ireland in the autumn of 1845, families who had expected full storage pits instead found large portions of their crops spoiled. Estimates later suggested that roughly 1/3 of the potato harvest had been lost during that first season. For a society so dependent on a single crop, even this partial loss created deep concern. Farmers and local officials began writing letters describing what they had seen. Newspapers printed reports of the strange disease spreading through the fields. Agricultural societies tried to investigate the problem, but reliable answers were difficult to find. Some observers believed the blight had arrived from continental Europe, where similar crop failures had been reported earlier that year. Others suspected unusual weather patterns might have played a role. Meanwhile, ordinary families faced a more immediate problem. Their winter food supply was smaller than expected. During that first year of the blight, many households managed to survive by stretching their remaining food. Potatoes that had not yet rotted could still be eaten if used quickly. Some families relied more heavily on oatmeal or other grains when available. Local charities and religious groups also began distributing limited aid in certain communities. The British government in London took notice of the situation and began discussing possible relief measures. At this early stage, however, few people imagined how severe the crisis would eventually become. There had been poor harvests before in Irish history. Hard seasons were not unknown in rural life. Many hoped that the blight might disappear as suddenly as it had arrived. Farmers prepared their fields again the following spring. Seed potatoes were planted with cautious optimism. If the crop recovered, the damage from the previous year might be only a temporary setback. Yet the conditions that allowed the blight to spread had not changed. The same damp climate that helped potatoes grow also created ideal conditions for the disease. When the summer of 1846 arrived, the fungus returned with even greater strength. But that chapter of the story would unfold gradually, as the months passed and the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. For now, in the autumn of 1845, many people across Ireland simply looked at their damaged fields and wondered whether the following year might bring better luck. The countryside remained quiet. Villages continued their routines. Markets still opened, and carts still travelled the narrow roads. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, something fundamental had begun to shift. A crop that had supported millions of people was no longer reliable. And as families looked toward the uncertain seasons ahead, the first steps of a vast migration were quietly beginning to take shape. In the decades before the potato blight appeared, Ireland had developed a rural society that rested on a delicate balance between land, population, and food. To understand why the failure of one crop could reshape the entire country, it helps to look closely at how ordinary people lived and worked across the Irish countryside in the early 19th century. Ireland at that time was overwhelmingly rural. Large industrial cities were rare, and the majority of people lived in villages, hamlets, or isolated cottages surrounded by small plots of farmland. These settlements were spread across a landscape of rolling green fields, stone walls, narrow dirt roads, and modest market towns that served as gathering places for trade. The social structure of land ownership had deep historical roots. For centuries, much of Ireland had been governed under a system shaped by British rule. During earlier periods of conquest and political change, large portions of land had passed into the hands of landlords who were often members of the Protestant Anglo-Irish elite. Many of these landlords did not personally farm their estates. Instead, they rented parcels of land to tenants who worked the soil and paid rent for the right to remain there. This arrangement created a layered system of farming. Large estates were divided into smaller farms, which were then subdivided further into even smaller plots. A single estate might support dozens or even hundreds of tenant families. These tenants were responsible for producing enough crops to pay rent and support their households. In some cases, they grew grain crops such as wheat, oats, or barley. But these crops were often used primarily as a source of income. Grain could be sold in markets or exported to help cover rent payments owed to landlords. The potato played a different role in this agricultural system. Unlike grain, potatoes were rarely grown for export. Instead, they were planted mainly for household consumption. They provided a dependable food supply for families living on very small pieces of land. One of the remarkable features of the potato was how productive it could be in a limited space. A small field planted with potatoes could yield far more calories than many other crops grown on the same ground. This meant that even a family with only a few acres could harvest enough food to sustain several people. The potato also required relatively simple tools to cultivate. A spade, basic soil preparation, and careful planting were often enough to produce a healthy crop. Because of this, even poorer families with limited resources could grow potatoes successfully. Over time, this efficiency encouraged a population pattern that depended heavily on the crop. Families could survive on smaller holdings than would have been possible with grain alone. As land was divided among children from one generation to the next, the potato allowed these smaller farms to remain viable. This system helped support Ireland's rapid population growth during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Villages expanded as families established new cottages near the land they farmed. Young couples often married and settled close to their parents, sometimes working a portion of the same fields. The rural cottage itself reflected the modest circumstances of most families. These homes were typically built from stone or packed earth, with thatched roofs made from straw or reeds. Many cottages contained only one or two rooms. Inside, a simple hearth served as the centre of cooking and heating. Furniture was minimal. A wooden table, a few stools or benches, and beds constructed from rough materials were common features. Despite these humble surroundings, cottages were often lively places where families gathered at the end of long working days. Meals reflected the crops grown nearby. Potatoes were prepared in many simple ways, often boiled and eaten with milk or buttermilk. Occasionally, small amounts of vegetables or fish supplemented the diet. Meat was less common for many rural families, though pigs or chickens were sometimes kept near the cottage. The potato's nutritional value made it possible for families to maintain relatively good health despite the simplicity of their meals. A diet centered on potatoes and milk provided important nutrients that supported daily labor in the fields. Agricultural work followed a seasonal rhythm that shaped the entire year. In the spring, planting began as farmers prepared the soil for potatoes and other crops. Through the summer months, fields required constant attention to keep weeds under control and ensure healthy growth. Autumn brought the most important period of the farming calendar, harvest time. Families worked together to gather crops before the arrival of colder weather. Potatoes were carefully dug from the ground and sorted for storage. These stored potatoes formed the foundation of winter survival. Families placed them in specially prepared pits lined with straw and earth, where the temperature remained stable enough to prevent freezing. As winter arrived, rural life became quieter. Fieldwork slowed, though daily tasks continued around the cottage and farmyard. Communities gathered for markets, church services, and seasonal traditions that had been passed down through generations. Despite the apparent stability of this way of life, the agricultural system carried hidden risks. Because potatoes were so productive, many families had come to rely on them almost entirely for food. Other crops were often grown primarily for economic purposes rather than household consumption. This meant that when the potato harvest succeeded, rural communities remained secure. But if the crop failed, there were few alternative food sources available locally. Another factor made the system even more fragile. Most tenant farmers did not hold permanent ownership of the land they worked. Their right to remain depended on their ability to pay rent each year. If a family could not meet these payments, the landlord had the legal authority to remove them from the property. In good harvest years, the balance between rent payments and household food supplies could be maintained. But when crops were damaged or lost, that balance quickly became difficult to sustain. By the early 1840s, many observers had already noticed the vulnerability of this structure. Economists and political leaders occasionally debated the risks of relying so heavily on a single crop, yet little practical change occurred. The system continued operating much as it had before, partly because it had functioned successfully for many years. As long as the potato remained healthy, it supported millions of people across Ireland's countryside. Then the blight appeared. When farmers first discovered the rotting potatoes in 1845, the immediate concern was the loss of that year's harvest. Yet the deeper danger lay in the possibility that the disease might return. Because potatoes were grown from seed potatoes taken from previous harvests, the entire crop cycle depended on healthy plants continuing from year to year. If the blight persisted, it could threaten future harvests as well. Farmers attempted various methods to protect their crops. Some experimented with different planting times or locations within their fields. Others tried storing seed potatoes more carefully, in hopes that the next season might produce stronger plants. Agricultural writers and newspapers began discussing possible explanations for the disease. The lack of scientific understanding made it difficult to identify effective solutions. Many farmers could only wait and hope that the blight would fade. As winter passed and the planting season of 1846 approached, families across Ireland prepared their fields again. Despite the concerns raised by the previous year's losses, most people still believed the coming harvest might restore normal conditions. Seed potatoes were placed into the soil during the spring months, just as they had been for generations. Fields that had once produced reliable crops were planted once more. Throughout the countryside, the same quiet routine returned. Farmers walked their fields to monitor the young plants. Villages continued their daily life. Markets opened as usual, but beneath that ordinary rhythm, uncertainty remained. The blight had already shown how quickly a healthy crop could disappear. If the disease returned in full force, the consequences would reach far beyond a single season. During the summer of 1846, those fears slowly began to take shape. What had once seemed like a troubling harvest failure was about to become something much larger, a crisis that would affect every corner of Irish society and eventually push countless families to consider leaving the country. Entirely, the blight spreads across Ireland. By the spring of 1846, the memory of the previous year's failed harvest still lingered across the Irish countryside. Families had endured a difficult winter, though in many places people had managed to stretch what remained of their food. Some households relied on oats or imported grain when they could obtain it. Others depended on small relief programs organised by local authorities or charitable groups. Yet despite these challenges, many farmers approached the new planting season with cautious determination. The fields had been prepared once again. Seed potatoes were placed into the soil with the same careful attention that had guided generations before them. There was a quiet hope that the disease seen the previous year might have been temporary. In villages and rural districts, daily life resumed its familiar rhythm. Families rose early to work the fields. Livestock were tended. Markets continued to operate in towns where farmers sold produce and purchased supplies. From a distance, much of the countryside appeared unchanged. During the early summer months, the potato plants began to grow once more. Their green leaves spread across the fields in wide rows that looked promising to anyone passing along the narrow roads between farms. At first there were signs that the crop might recover, but by midsummer, troubling reports began to surface again. Farmers noticed dark spots appearing on the leaves of their potato plants. At first, the marks were small, similar to those that had appeared during the previous year. In earlier seasons, occasional leaf damage could occur from weather or insects, so some farmers initially assumed the problem might be minor. Within days, however, the damage intensified. Leaves turned dark and brittle. The healthy green colour faded into patches of brown and black. Entire rows of plants began to collapse across the fields. When farmers dug into the soil to examine the potatoes themselves, they found the same destructive rot that had appeared the previous year. This time, the disease spread far more quickly. The organism responsible for the blight thrived in the damp Irish climate. Rainfall and cool temperatures created ideal conditions for it to move from one field to another. Spores carried by wind and moisture allowed the disease to travel across large areas in a short time. During the late summer of 1846, reports from farmers across multiple counties described the same pattern. A field that appeared healthy one week could be ruined the next. Potatoes that looked normal during harvest often decayed shortly after being lifted from the soil. What had been a partial crop failure in 1845 was now becoming something much larger. Agricultural observers began recording the scale of the destruction. In many regions, the blight destroyed nearly the entire potato harvest. Fields that had once supported whole communities produced almost nothing usable. The loss was devastating because the potato harvest formed the main food supply for millions of people. When the crop failed, there were few alternatives available locally. Grain crops existed, but these were often already committed to rent payments or export markets. As news of the widespread crop failure reached towns and cities, concern began to grow among officials and political leaders. Ireland was part of the United Kingdom at this time, governed through British political institutions in London. Administrators in Dublin Castle oversaw the management of Irish affairs. When reports of the blight reached government officials, they began collecting information from local authorities to understand the situation more clearly. Some early efforts had already been made during the previous year to prepare for possible shortages. Limited imports of grain had been arranged. Committees were formed to monitor food supplies and discuss relief options. But the scale of the 1846 crop failure created challenges far beyond those earlier preparations. The British government faced a complex situation. On one hand, there was growing recognition that millions of people might face severe food shortages. On the other hand, economic policy at the time emphasized minimal government interference in markets. Many influential policymakers believed that food supply should be managed through trade and private commerce rather than large state programs. They argued that importing grain and allowing markets to adjust prices would help stabilize the situation. At the same time, local communities across Ireland began experiencing the immediate consequences of the failed harvest. As autumn approached in 1846, farmers discovered that most of the potatoes stored from the new crop were already rotting. Storage pits that would normally provide food through the winter now contained spoiled produce. Families who had relied almost entirely on this harvest suddenly faced an uncertain future. In rural districts, people began searching for any available food sources. Some turned to small quantities of grain that had been reserved for sale. Others gathered wild plants or relied on fishing when possible. These efforts provided limited relief but could not replace the vast quantity of food normally supplied by the potato crop. Local markets also began to change. Prices for available food rose as demand increased. Grain that had once been affordable for occasional purchase became difficult for poorer families to obtain. Community leaders, clergy, and charitable organizations began organizing assistance for those most affected. Soup kitchens and relief committees appeared in several areas. These groups attempted to distribute food or provide employment to those struggling to support their families. Even with these efforts, the scale of need grew rapidly. As the autumn of 1846 progressed, more reports reached government officials describing widespread hardship. Rural labourers who had previously depended on small farms or seasonal work now faced both unemployment and food shortages. Public discussion of the crisis expanded in newspapers and political meetings. Some commentators urged stronger government intervention to prevent mass suffering. Others argued that relief efforts should remain limited to avoid disrupting economic systems. While these debates unfolded in cities and government offices, ordinary families in the countryside confronted immediate decisions about survival. Some households attempted to remain on their farms by selling livestock or personal belongings to purchase food. Others sought temporary work in nearby towns. Public works programs were gradually introduced, offering labour on road construction and other projects in exchange for wages. Yet even these programs struggled to meet the growing demand. The failure of the potato crop had affected such a large portion of the population that available work and relief resources quickly became overwhelmed. Villages that had once been stable farming communities now faced rising levels of poverty. During this period, the idea of leaving Ireland began to appear in conversations among families and neighbours. Migration was not entirely new to Irish society. For many years, individuals had travelled to Britain or North America in search of work. Seasonal labour migration to England and Scotland was common in certain regions. But what began to change during the famine years was the scale of this movement. Families who had once expected to remain on the same land for generations began considering permanent departure. Letters from relatives abroad sometimes described opportunities in cities across the Atlantic. Though the journey was long and uncertain, it offered the possibility of escape from worsening conditions. By the end of 1846, the crisis had moved beyond a simple agricultural problem. The repeated failure of the potato harvest had disrupted the entire foundation of rural life. Communities that had relied on predictable farming cycles now faced uncertainty about how the coming winter would unfold. Relief programs were expanding, but they remained limited compared to the vast number of people in need. Across Ireland, families quietly began preparing for difficult choices. Some would attempt to endure the coming months in hopes that the next harvest might succeed. Others would gradually begin planning a journey that would carry them far from the fields where their families had lived for generations. The years ahead would show how these individual decisions combined into one of the largest migrations of the 19th century. Hunger in the countryside. By the late months of 1846, the failed harvest had moved from a worrying agricultural problem into a daily reality that shaped life across the Irish countryside. The potato fields that normally provided food for the winter had yielded almost nothing usable. Storage pits that would usually hold a family's supply for months contained spoiled and blackened tubers. In villages scattered across the landscape, households began adjusting to a new and unfamiliar routine. Instead of planning meals around the dependable potato harvest, families searched for whatever food could still be found. Small amounts of grain, vegetables, or milk became more important than before, though many households had very limited access to these alternatives. The countryside itself remained visually calm. Fields still stretched across the hills. Stone cottages stood beside narrow roads that wound between farms. Livestock moved slowly through pastures as they always had. Yet inside many homes, the question of how to secure the next meal had become a constant concern. For families who had relied almost entirely on the potato crop, the sudden loss created immediate difficulty. The potato had been more than just a food. It had been the foundation of the rural diet. When boiled potatoes and milk disappeared from the table, there was no easy substitute that could provide the same quantity of nourishment. At first, many households attempted to stretch whatever supplies remained from earlier stores. Potatoes that had not yet completely rotted were eaten quickly before they spoiled further. Some families mixed small amounts of oats or meal with water to create thin porridge. Others relied on local networks of support. rural communities often maintained traditions of helping neighbours during difficult seasons. When one household had slightly more food than another, it might be shared in modest quantities, but as the months passed, the number of families in need grew steadily. What had once been occasional hardship was becoming widespread across entire districts. Local priests, ministers, and community leaders began organising relief efforts. Churches played an important role in coordinating aid because they already served as gathering places where information could spread quickly. Parish committees collected donations when possible and distributed food to those who had none. Charitable groups in towns also began sending supplies to rural areas. These shipments often included grain that could be ground into meal for bread or porridge. However, transportation networks were limited, and the amount of food arriving in each district was often small compared to the number of people who required assistance. At the same time, the price of available food in markets began to rise. Markets in Irish towns had always been places where farmers and traders exchanged goods. In ordinary years, grain, vegetables and livestock moved through these markets in predictable cycles. When the potato harvest failed, demand for alternative foods increased sharply. As more people attempted to purchase grain, prices climbed beyond what many labourers could afford. For families that had already lost their main food supply, the rising cost of basic provisions made survival even more difficult. Seasonal labour had once provided additional income for many rural workers. During planting and harvest periods, farms required extra hands. But when crops failed, the demand for agricultural labour also declined. Without steady work, many labourers found themselves without wages at the same moment that food prices were increasing. In response to these growing difficulties, the British government began expanding certain relief programmes. Officials recognised that the famine conditions required some form of organised assistance. Yet debates continued within political circles about how much intervention was appropriate. One widely discussed approach involved public works projects. Under this system, the government funded construction projects such as road building or drainage improvements. Labourers who worked on these projects received wages, which they could then use to purchase food. Public works programmes were intended to provide employment rather than direct food distribution. This approach aligned with prevailing economic ideas that emphasised work in exchange for relief. Across parts of Ireland, large numbers of men gathered to participate in these projects. Roads were extended or repaired. Drainage ditches were dug across farmland. In many areas, these projects temporarily employed thousands of labourers. Yet the system also faced challenges. The wages offered through public works were often small, and payment delays sometimes occurred due to administrative difficulties. In remote regions, reaching the work sites could require long walks from rural cottages. For individuals weakened by hunger, the physical demands of construction labour were difficult to endure. While these programs provided some income for families, they did not fully address the shortage of food that many communities faced. Another institution that became increasingly central during the famine years was the workhouse. Workhouses had been established earlier under the poor law system, designed to provide shelter and basic support for those unable to support themselves. These facilities existed in many districts across Ireland, each intended to serve a particular region known as a poor law union. Under ordinary circumstances, workhouses housed a limited number of people who required assistance due to illness, disability, or extreme poverty. As the famine intensified, the number of people seeking entry to these institutions began to rise rapidly. Families who could no longer secure food or employment sometimes turned to the workhouse as a last resort. Entering the workhouse meant accepting strict conditions, including separation of men, women, and children into different wards. The environment inside was regulated and crowded. Despite these hardships, workhouses provided one crucial benefit: regular meals. By the winter of 1846 and early months of 1847, many workhouses across Ireland had reached or exceeded their intended capacity. Buildings designed to house a few hundred individuals sometimes held far more. Outside the walls of these institutions, the countryside continued to struggle with food shortages. Observers travelling through rural districts during this period recorded scenes that illustrated the widespread nature of the crisis. Villages that had once been busy farming communities now showed signs of decline. Some cottages stood empty after families had moved elsewhere in search of food or work. Others remained occupied but quiet, as residents conserved their energy and resources during the difficult winter months. Relief committees attempted to track the scale of need across different regions. Reports described families living on extremely limited rations and relying heavily on charity. Government inspectors travelled between districts to collect information about food supplies and employment programs. Even with these efforts, the full scope of the crisis was difficult to measure in real time. At the same moment, the social fabric of rural Ireland began to shift. Long-standing patterns of farming and village life were gradually disrupted. Families who had expected to remain on the same land indefinitely were now forced to reconsider their future. Conversations about migration began appearing more frequently within communities. Some individuals had relatives who had already travelled to Britain or North America in earlier decades. Letters occasionally arrived describing work opportunities in distant cities or farms in new territories. For families facing uncertain prospects at home, these stories began to carry greater weight. Yet the decision to leave was not simple. Crossing the Atlantic required money for passage on a ship. It also meant leaving behind familiar landscapes, neighbours, and traditions that had defined rural life for generations. During these early famine years, most people still hoped that conditions might improve before such drastic steps became necessary. Farmers continued to prepare their fields as best they could. Despite the destruction caused by the blight, planting efforts continued whenever seed potatoes could be obtained. There remained a belief that the disease might eventually fade. But as the famine extended into its second full year, the challenges facing rural communities were becoming increasingly severe. The countryside that had once supported millions through a dependable agricultural cycle now faced a prolonged disruption. Hunger, unemployment, and overcrowded relief systems were slowly reshaping the structure of Irish society. In the months ahead, these pressures would continue to grow, pushing more families toward decisions that would alter their lives permanently. Government responses and political debate. As the crisis deepened across Ireland during the later months of 1846, attention increasingly turned toward government policy and the question of how relief should be organised. Reports describing crop failure, rising food prices, and growing hardship reached administrative offices in Dublin and London with increasing frequency. Officials were now confronted with the reality that the failure of the potato crop had affected a large portion of the population. Ireland at this time formed part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, governed by the British Parliament in London. Irish affairs were administered locally through Dublin Castle, where government representatives collected information from counties and implemented national policies. When the famine began to spread, both of these political centres became involved in discussions about how the situation should be managed. The early responses reflected the economic ideas that were widely accepted during the mid-19th century. Many political leaders believed strongly in the principles of free trade and limited government interference in markets. According to these views, the movement of food and goods should be guided primarily by private commerce rather than large-scale state intervention. Supporters of this approach argued that markets would eventually correct shortages if trade remained open. If food prices rose, merchants would have an incentive to import additional supplies from other regions where crops had been successful. In theory, this process would bring more grain into Ireland and stabilise availability. At the same time, there was growing recognition that immediate relief was necessary to prevent widespread suffering. Government officials therefore began introducing a series of measures intended to provide assistance while still respecting the broader economic philosophy of the period. One of the earliest actions taken by the government involved the importation of maize, often called Indian corn, from North America. Maize had not traditionally been part of the Irish diet, but it could be stored and transported in large quantities. Government agents arranged shipments of maize to Irish ports, where it could be distributed through local markets. This policy was intended to increase the overall supply of food while avoiding direct control of prices. The maize was sold rather than given away freely, though it was often offered at reduced cost compared to other grains. While this measure helped introduce additional food into the country, it also presented practical difficulties. Many people in rural Ireland were unfamiliar with maize and required guidance on how to prepare it for cooking. Grinding the grain into meal was necessary before it could be used effectively, and some regions lacked the appropriate milling facilities. Despite these challenges, maize became an important supplement during the early famine years, providing a source of nourishment when potatoes were unavailable. Meanwhile, the public works programs that had been introduced earlier continued to expand. These projects aimed to provide employment to labourers who had lost income due to the collapse of agricultural work. Roads, bridges, drainage systems, and other infrastructure improvements were funded through government programs that paid wages to participants. Across Ireland, large numbers of men enrolled in these projects. In some counties, the sight of long lines of labourers working along newly constructed roads became a common feature of the landscape. The intention behind these programs was to allow families to purchase food using wages earned through labour rather than receiving direct charity. This approach reflected the belief that relief should encourage self-support rather than dependence. However, the rapid growth of these programs soon revealed logistical problems. As more individuals sought employment through public works, the administrative system struggled to keep pace. Supervisors had to organise thousands of workers across scattered locations, and payment systems were sometimes slow. In certain areas, wages were delayed for weeks. Labourers who had expected regular income found themselves waiting for compensation while still needing to purchase food for their families. Another concern emerged from the physical demands of the work itself. Road building and drainage projects required significant manual labour. For individuals already weakened by hunger, these tasks could be exhausting. Observers occasionally reported that workers struggled to maintain the pace required to complete projects. While these difficulties became apparent, political debates continued regarding the proper role of government in managing the famine. Within the British Parliament, some members argued that stronger intervention was necessary to prevent further suffering. They pointed to reports describing the growing number of families seeking relief and the overcrowded conditions in workhouses. Others maintained that excessive government control could disrupt agricultural markets and create long-term economic problems. They believed that relief measures should remain temporary and limited. These debates reflected broader disagreements about economic policy that extended beyond the famine itself. Questions about trade, government responsibility, and social welfare were widely discussed throughout Britain during this period. At the same time, Irish political leaders and local officials voiced their own concerns. Some argued that the policies adopted in London did not fully account for the unique conditions facing rural Ireland. They emphasised the scale of dependence on the potato crop and the vulnerability created by widespread tenant farming. Newspapers in both Ireland and Britain published articles examining the crisis from different perspectives. Some editorials called for expanded relief programmes, while others warned against policies that might undermine existing economic systems. Meanwhile, administrators in Dublin Castle attempted to gather accurate information about conditions across the country. Inspectors travelled through various counties to report on crop failures, food prices, and the effectiveness of relief programmes. These reports revealed that the impact of the famine varied from region to region. Some districts experienced severe shortages earlier than others. Coastal areas sometimes had slightly better access to imported food through nearby ports, while inland regions faced greater challenges in obtaining supplies. Despite these regional differences, the overall trend remained clear. The failure of the potato crop had disrupted the primary food source for millions of people. By the early months of 1847, the situation had grown even more serious. The winter following the 1846 harvest proved particularly difficult in many rural areas. Workhouses continued to fill with families seeking assistance. Public works programs struggled to provide sufficient employment for everyone who needed it. As these pressures mounted, government officials began reconsidering some of their earlier policies. One of the changes introduced during this period involved expanding the role of direct food relief. Soup kitchens were organized in certain areas to provide prepared meals to large numbers of people. These kitchens allowed relief committees to distribute food quickly and efficiently, without requiring recipients to purchase grain or cook it themselves. The introduction of soup kitchens represented a shift toward more direct humanitarian assistance. In many districts, they became an essential source of nourishment for families who had no other reliable access to food. At the same time, discussions continued about longer-term solutions to the crisis. Some policymakers believed that structural changes in Irish agriculture might eventually reduce dependence on the potato crop. Others focused on improving land management and encouraging different farming practices. Yet for ordinary families facing the immediate challenges of the famine years, these broader debates offered little comfort. Across the countryside, daily life remained shaped by uncertainty about food supplies, employment, and the coming harvests. The policies developed in government offices influenced the availability of relief, but the practical effects were often felt gradually in distant villages and farms. During these years of political discussion and administrative adjustment, another development was quietly beginning to reshape Irish society. More and more families were considering the possibility of leaving the country altogether. Workhouses and relief programs. As the famine stretched into 1847, relief systems that had once been designed for occasional hardship were now responsible for supporting large portions of the Irish population. What had begun as scattered assistance from local charities and limited government programs gradually developed into a more organized network of aid. Yet these institutions were under enormous strain as the number of people seeking help continued to grow. Among the most visible elements of this system were the workhouses. Workhouses had been established earlier in the 19th century under the Irish Poor Law, which aimed to provide a structured form of relief for those who could not support themselves. The system divided Ireland into administrative districts known as poor law unions. Each union maintained a workhouse building intended to shelter and feed individuals who had no other means of survival. In theory, workhouses were meant to discourage reliance on public assistance by maintaining strict living conditions. The idea was that people would seek entry only when they had exhausted all other options. Life inside these institutions was intentionally modest and highly regulated. Before the famine, most workhouses housed a relatively small number of residents. These were often elderly individuals, people suffering from illness, or families facing temporary hardship. The facilities were designed to hold a limited population, and under ordinary circumstances they functioned within that capacity. The famine changed this balance very quickly. As food shortages spread and employment opportunities disappeared, increasing numbers of families began arriving at workhouse gates. For many, entering the workhouse represented a final step after exhausting every other possibility for survival. The process of admission required individuals to surrender a degree of independence. Families were separated into different sections of the building. Men, women, and children were housed in separate wards, a policy intended to maintain order within the institution. Inside the workhouse, daily routines were carefully structured. Residents followed a schedule that included work assignments when possible, along with set times for meals and rest. The food provided was simple but consistent, typically including items such as oatmeal, bread, or soup. For those who had gone days without reliable meals, even these modest rations represented a significant improvement. However, as the famine intensified, the number of people seeking entry far exceeded the capacity of many facilities. Workhouses built to accommodate several hundred residents sometimes found themselves responsible for far larger populations. In some districts, administrators were forced to add temporary sleeping areas in corridors or other available spaces. Overcrowding became a common feature of many institutions. The strain on resources made it difficult to maintain the original standards envisioned by the poor law system. Despite these challenges, workhouses remained an important source of relief during the famine years. They provided shelter and food to families who had no other place to turn. Alongside the workhouse system, another form of assistance expanded rapidly during 1847, the establishment of soup kitchens. These kitchens represented a different approach to relief. Instead of housing individuals within an institution, soup kitchens distributed prepared meals directly to the public. Large quantities of soup or porridge could be cooked in centralized locations and served to hundreds or even thousands of people each day. The advantage of this system was efficiency. Food could be provided quickly to large numbers of people without requiring them to enter a workhouse. In communities where hunger had become widespread, soup kitchens became gathering places where families lined up daily to receive nourishment. The organization of these kitchens often involved cooperation between government authorities, religious groups, and local volunteers. Supplies of grain or meal were transported to distribution centers, where cooks prepared large vats of soup. In many towns and villages, the sight of long lines forming outside soup kitchens became part of everyday life during the worst months of the famine. Reports from the time describe how entire communities depended on these programs. Children arrived carrying small containers to collect food for their families. Elderly individuals who could not travel far relied on neighbours or relatives to bring meals back to their cottages. Although the soup kitchens played a crucial role in preventing even greater suffering, they were also temporary measures. The programs required continuous supplies of food and funding, both of which depended on government support and charitable contributions. Meanwhile, the workhouse system continued operating alongside these new relief efforts. Administrators attempted to manage admissions carefully, but the pressure on facilities remained intense. Disease also began appearing more frequently within overcrowded institutions. When large numbers of people lived in close quarters with limited sanitation, illnesses could spread quickly. Medical staff worked under difficult conditions as they attempted to care for residents while managing the rising number of cases. Outside the walls of these institutions, rural communities continued to face ongoing hardship. Even with relief programs in place, many families struggled to secure enough food to sustain themselves. The landscape of the countryside slowly began to change as the famine persisted. Some cottages that had once housed active farming families were now empty. Their former occupants had either entered workhouses, moved to towns in search of employment, or begun planning journeys abroad. At the same time, landlords across Ireland were confronting their own financial pressures. Many estates depended on rent payments from tenants to maintain operations. When tenants could no longer pay rent due to crop failures and unemployment, landlords faced declining income. This situation contributed to a process that would become increasingly significant during the famine years: the eviction of tenants who could not meet their obligations. For families already struggling to obtain food, the loss of their home and farmland added another layer of uncertainty. Some evicted tenants sought shelter with relatives or neighbours. Others turned to workhouses or relief programs for assistance. These developments gradually pushed more families toward a difficult decision. Leaving Ireland had always been a possibility, but during the famine years it began to appear as a practical response to circumstances that seemed unlikely to improve quickly. Ships departing from Irish ports carried passengers toward Britain, Canada, and the United States. At first, these departures involved relatively small numbers of individuals. Yet, as the crisis continued, migration would grow into a major movement of people seeking new opportunities far from the fields where their lives had begun. For many families standing in line at soup kitchens or seeking admission to crowded workhouses, the idea of starting again in another country slowly began to take shape. Evictions and land clearances. As the famine continued into the later 1840s, another powerful force began shaping the lives of rural families across Ireland. While hunger and unemployment had already strained communities, the structure of land ownership introduced an additional pressure that many households could not escape. Most tenant farmers lived on land that they did not own. Their cottages and small plots existed under rental agreements with landlords who controlled large estates. In ordinary years, these arrangements functioned within a fragile balance. Tenants paid rent after harvest seasons, and landlords relied on those payments to maintain their estates. But when the potato crop failed repeatedly, that balance quickly collapsed. Families who had once relied on their harvest to feed themselves and pay rent suddenly found themselves unable to meet financial obligations. With the loss of their main food supply, many tenants had little income to offer landlords. At the same time, landlords themselves faced financial pressures. Estates often carried debts or administrative expenses that depended on regular rent payments. Without this income, some landlords struggled to maintain their properties or meet obligations of their own. Within this environment, evictions began to appear more frequently across the countryside. Eviction was the legal process through which a landlord removed tenants from land they could no longer afford to rent. The process often began with notices informing tenants that their lease or agreement had ended due to unpaid rent. For families already facing hunger and uncertainty, such notices created an immediate crisis. When an eviction order was carried out, tenants were required to leave the land and cottages they had occupied. In some cases, neighbours or relatives offered temporary shelter. In other situations, families were forced to gather their belongings and travel elsewhere in search of assistance. These events were not identical in every region. Some landlords attempted to delay evictions or organise limited relief for struggling tenants. Others arranged assisted passages for tenants willing to emigrate abroad. However, many estates proceeded with clearances that removed large numbers of tenants from small farms. Landlords sometimes believed that reducing the number of small holdings would allow their estates to shift toward larger grazing farms, which required fewer tenants and could be easier to manage economically. As a result, certain districts experienced significant changes in their population. Travellers moving through parts of rural Ireland during these years sometimes observed cottages that had been abandoned or dismantled after tenants left. Fields that had once been divided into many small plots were occasionally reorganised into larger tracts of land. For the families involved, eviction was not simply a legal event. It represented the loss of the place where they had lived and worked, sometimes for generations. The rural cottage had often been built by the family itself, using local stone or earth. Gardens and potato patches nearby had supported daily life for many years. Leaving such places behind meant stepping into an uncertain future with limited resources. Once removed from their land, families faced several possible paths. Some travelled to nearby towns in hopes of finding employment or assistance through relief programs. Workhouses received increasing numbers of people who had been displaced from rural areas. Others attempted to relocate within the countryside by renting land elsewhere, though opportunities for new tenancies were limited during the famine years. Increasingly, however, eviction contributed to the growth of migration. For families who had already lost their crops and their homes, leaving Ireland entirely began to appear as a practical choice rather than a distant idea. If survival in the countryside was no longer possible, the prospect of starting a new life abroad gained greater attention. Ports along the Irish coast gradually became departure points for those seeking opportunities in other countries. Ships carried passengers toward destinations such as Liverpool, Glasgow, Quebec, Boston and New York. Some migrants travelled first to Britain, where industrial cities offered employment in factories or construction. Others aimed for North America, where expanding cities and agricultural regions created demand for labour. The journey across the Atlantic required payment for passage, and not every family possessed the necessary funds. Sometimes, relatives who had already emigrated sent money to help others follow. In other cases, landlords contributed to travel costs as part of arrangements encouraging tenants to leave their estates. These departures slowly altered the composition of rural communities. Villages that had once been filled with large families and busy farms began to shrink. Each season saw more cottages standing empty as residents moved elsewhere. Parish records from the time often show declining populations in areas that had previously been crowded with tenant households. Meanwhile, those who remained faced continuing uncertainty. Even families who had avoided eviction still confronted the same underlying difficulties that had triggered the crisis. The potato crop remained unreliable due to the continuing presence of blight. Relief programs and workhouses provided assistance but could not fully replace the lost agricultural system. In this environment, discussions about migration spread from household to household. Letters arriving from relatives abroad played an important role in shaping these conversations. Migrants who had already settled in cities such as Boston or New York sometimes described the work they had found and the wages they earned. Though life in these new environments could be challenging, the opportunity to earn steady income appeared attractive compared to the instability at home. For families facing eviction or severe poverty, these letters served as both information and encouragement. By the late 1840s, emigration had begun transforming from a temporary response to hardship into a broader movement that would reshape Irish society. The combination of hunger, unemployment, and displacement from the land pushed increasing numbers of people toward the ports where ships waited to carry them across the ocean. The decision to leave. By the late 1840s, emigration was no longer an unfamiliar idea in Ireland, but the famine years transformed its meaning and scale. For generations, some Irish men and women had travelled abroad in search of work. Seasonal labourers crossed the Irish Sea to Britain during harvest months. Others had left permanently for North America, especially during earlier decades when land and opportunity attracted migrants across the Atlantic. What changed during the famine was the number of families who began to see departure not as an opportunity, but as a necessity. In villages throughout the countryside, conversations about leaving Ireland appeared with increasing frequency. These discussions often began quietly within households. Parents considered the future of their children. Younger adults wondered whether remaining on the land offered any realistic path forward. The conditions that shaped these decisions varied from place to place. In some districts, the repeated failure of the potato crop made it difficult to secure enough food for even basic survival. In others, evictions had already removed families from the small farms where they once worked. For many people, the possibility of migration was connected to letters arriving from relatives abroad. Over several decades, earlier waves of Irish migrants had established small communities in cities across Britain, Canada, and the United States. These migrants often wrote home, describing the places where they had settled. Their letters sometimes included practical information about work, wages, and living conditions. In cities such as Liverpool, Glasgow, Boston, and New York, Irish labourers had found employment in construction, dock work, domestic service, and other forms of manual labour. Although these jobs were often demanding, they provided wages that could support a household. For families living through the famine years, such reports offered a glimpse of possibilities beyond the struggling fields of Ireland. Yet the decision to leave was rarely simple. Most rural families had limited financial resources. Passage across the Atlantic required payment for a ship ticket, and even travel to nearby British cities carried expenses. Before departure could occur, households often had to gather money from whatever sources remained available. Some families sold livestock or personal belongings to obtain travel funds. Others relied on assistance from relatives who had already emigrated and sent money back to Ireland. In certain cases, landlords offered financial support for tenants willing to relocate abroad, particularly when estates were undergoing restructuring. Even when funds were secured, preparing for departure involved difficult choices. Families had to decide who would travel and who might remain behind. Occasionally, a younger family member left first, intending to find work abroad and later help other relatives follow. In other cases, entire households prepared for the journey together. Before leaving, families often spent time visiting neighbours and extended relatives. Rural communities were closely connected through shared work, church life, and local traditions. Departure meant leaving behind familiar landscapes as well as the people who had formed the fabric of daily life. For many emigrants, the final days before departure were spent travelling toward coastal ports. Ireland possessed several ports that became major departure points during the famine years. Cork, Dublin, Limerick, and smaller coastal towns all saw increasing numbers of passengers boarding ships bound for Britain or North America. Some migrants travelled first to Liverpool, one of the busiest ports in the British Isles where transatlantic vessels departed regularly. The journey from inland villages to these ports could itself take several days. Families often travelled by foot, cart, or local transport while carrying the belongings they could manage. Clothing, small tools, and a few personal items were packed for the long voyage ahead. Once they reached the port cities, emigrants entered an environment very different from the quiet rural districts they had left behind. Harbours were busy places filled with ships arriving and departing from across the Atlantic world. Merchants, sailors and travellers moved constantly through the docks. For people who had spent most of their lives in small villages, the scale and noise of these ports could be overwhelming. Agents representing shipping companies sold tickets to passengers heading overseas. These agents helped organise the boarding process, though the quality of travel arrangements varied widely depending on the ship and the cost of passage. Many emigrants purchased the least expensive tickets available, which meant travelling in crowded conditions below deck. Space was limited, and passengers often brought their own food supplies for the voyage. Despite these challenges, the opportunity to leave Ireland carried a sense of possibility. Families preparing to board ships understood that the journey ahead would be long and uncertain. Crossing the Atlantic Ocean could take several weeks depending on weather and the type of vessel. Yet for many, the hardships of the voyage seemed preferable to the conditions they faced at home. During the famine years, the number of ships departing with emigrants increased dramatically. Shipping companies responded to growing demand by expanding routes between Irish ports and destinations in North America. Canada, in particular, became a common destination because British shipping regulations often required vessels carrying timber from Canada to return with passengers rather than travelling empty. These arrangements created relatively inexpensive opportunities for emigrants to cross the Atlantic. The growing flow of migrants transformed ports on both sides of the ocean. In Ireland, docks became gathering places for families preparing to leave. In North America, arrival points such as Quebec, Halifax, and New York began receiving increasing numbers of Irish passengers. At first, many emigrants believed that leaving Ireland might be temporary. Some hoped that conditions at home would improve in the future, allowing them to return after earning money abroad. However, as the famine continued and migration expanded, it became clear that many departures would lead to permanent resettlement. Communities and cities across the Atlantic began to develop distinct Irish identities as new arrivals joined earlier migrants. Churches, neighbourhoods, and social networks formed around shared cultural traditions. Back in Ireland, the departure of neighbours and relatives gradually altered the composition of villages. Each ship that left the harbour carried not only individuals but also pieces of the social life that had once filled the countryside. The famine had begun as an agricultural disaster rooted in the failure of a single crop, but as the years passed, it evolved into a movement of people that stretched across oceans. Families standing on the docks of Irish ports during the late 1840s could not yet see the full scale of this transformation. They simply prepared for a journey that would carry them toward unfamiliar lands and uncertain futures. In the chapters ahead, those voyages across the Atlantic would become a defining experience of the famine migration, coffin ships and Atlantic voyages. As more Irish families began leaving their villages and travelling toward the coast, the journey across the Atlantic became one of the most defining experiences of the famine years. The voyage itself was long, uncertain, and often uncomfortable, yet it represented the bridge between the hardship people were leaving behind and the possibility of a different future abroad. During the middle of the 19th century, most long-distance ocean travel still depended on sailing ships. Steamships were beginning to appear on some routes, but the majority of migrants crossed the Atlantic on wooden sailing vessels that relied on wind and weather to complete the journey. These ships had originally been designed for transporting cargo rather than large numbers of passengers. During the famine years, however, many shipping companies adapted them to carry migrants because the demand for travel increased so quickly. Vessels leaving Irish or British ports typically sailed toward Canada or the northeastern United States. The journey could take anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks, depending on wind conditions and the route chosen by the captain. For passengers, the conditions on board were often crowded. Most emigrants purchased the least expensive tickets available, which allowed them to travel in the lower sections of the ship known as steerage. This part of the vessel was located below the main deck, where wooden bunks were arranged in narrow rows to hold as many passengers as possible. Each family usually received a small area for sleeping and storing their belongings. Space was limited, and privacy was almost non-existent. Passengers often shared the same enclosed areas for the entire voyage. Food arrangements varied depending on the ship and the terms of the ticket. Some shipping companies provided basic provisions such as bread, oatmeal, or salted meat. In many cases, however, emigrants were expected to bring their own supplies to last the entire journey. Families departing from Irish ports often carried sacks of meal, biscuits, or other preserved foods that could be eaten during the weeks at sea. Fresh water was stored in barrels and rationed carefully by the crew. Cooking facilities were minimal. A small galley stove might be available for passengers to heat food, but with hundreds of people on board, access to cooking space could be limited. The early days of the voyage were often marked by seasickness among passengers who had never travelled by ship before. The constant motion of the vessel, combined with the crowded conditions below deck, made the first week particularly difficult for many travellers. As the ship moved farther into the Atlantic, daily life settled into a slow routine. Passengers spent time on deck whenever weather allowed, where fresh air offered relief from the confined spaces below. Families shared stories, watched the horizon, and tried to maintain a sense of order during the long crossing. Children played in the narrow open areas available on deck. Adults sometimes assisted each other with cooking or caring for family members who had fallen ill during the voyage. Despite these efforts to maintain normal routines, the journey presented serious challenges. Ships carrying large numbers of passengers often struggled to maintain adequate sanitation. Water supplies had to be used carefully, and washing facilities were limited. In crowded conditions, illnesses could spread quickly among passengers. During the famine migration, diseases such as typhus and dysentery sometimes appeared on board ships travelling across the Atlantic. These illnesses were not unique to famine voyages. They had been present in maritime travel for many years. However, the large number of migrants travelling under difficult conditions increased the risk of outbreaks. When sickness appeared on a vessel, the crew attempted to manage the situation as best they could. Sick passengers might be moved to slightly separated areas if space allowed. Fresh air on deck and careful rationing of supplies were sometimes used to reduce the spread of illness. Even with these precautions, some voyages experienced significant health problems. Because of these dangers, certain ships carrying famine migrants later became known by the nickname coffin ships. The term reflected the difficult conditions experienced during some voyages and the loss of life that occasionally occurred at sea. It is important to note that not every ship earned this reputation. Some captains and crews maintained better standards of cleanliness and organisation, resulting in safer crossings for passengers. Nevertheless, the nickname became associated with the broader migration because of the hardships many travellers faced during their journey. As ships approached the western side of the Atlantic, passengers began preparing for arrival. Weeks of travel slowly gave way to the first signs of land appearing on the horizon. For those sailing toward Canada, the port of Quebec became a major entry point during the famine years. Ships travelling toward the United States often arrived in cities such as New York or Boston. Before passengers could enter these destinations, however, they frequently passed through quarantine stations designed to inspect arriving ships. Quarantine procedures were intended to prevent the spread of disease into busy port cities. Medical officials boarded incoming vessels to examine passengers and identify anyone who appeared ill. In Canada, one of the most well-known quarantine sites was Grosse Isle, located in the St. Lawrence River downstream from Quebec City. Ships carrying migrants often stopped there so passengers could undergo medical inspection before continuing inland. At these stations, passengers sometimes remained for several days or weeks depending on the health conditions observed on board. Those who showed signs of illness were treated in quarantine hospitals, while others waited for clearance to proceed. For many migrants, these first steps onto land marked the end of a long and exhausting journey. Yet arrival did not immediately solve the challenges facing new immigrants. Most passengers had little money left after paying for passage. They now needed to find employment, housing, and communities in unfamiliar cities. Still, the moment of arrival represented a turning point. The ocean crossing had carried them away from the famine-stricken countryside of Ireland. Ahead lay new environments shaped by growing cities, expanding industries, and diverse populations from many parts of the world. In the years that followed, Irish migrants would begin forming communities in these new places, slowly building networks that would shape both their own future and the societies they had joined. But before that transformation could take place, the famine itself would reach its most difficult phase. The year that followed would become known in Ireland simply as Black 47, arrival in new worlds. By the time ships carrying Irish migrants reached the western shores of the Atlantic, the passengers on board had already experienced weeks of uncertainty at sea. The long voyage, the crowded quarters, and the unfamiliar environment of the ship were behind them. Yet arrival in North America marked only the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. For many migrants travelling during the famine years, the first destination was not their final home, but a major port city where newcomers gathered before moving elsewhere. Canada and the United States received large numbers of Irish arrivals, and several ports became key entry points for this movement. In British North America, the port of Quebec served as one of the principal arrival locations. Ships moving up the St. Lawrence River often stopped first at quarantine stations where passengers underwent inspection for signs of illness. One of the most significant of these stations was located on Grosse Isle, an island positioned along the river route toward Quebec City. Medical officers at the quarantine station boarded ships and evaluated the health of passengers. Because of the conditions that sometimes developed during the long ocean crossing, quarantine procedures were taken seriously. Travellers suspected of carrying infectious diseases were separated for treatment in hospital facilities on the island. Others waited in temporary accommodations while the ship's inspection process was completed. Once cleared, migrants were allowed to continue toward Quebec City itself, where new arrivals entered a busy colonial port that was already accustomed to transatlantic trade and migration. For many Irish passengers, the sight of Quebec marked the first glimpse of a landscape very different from the countryside they had left behind. Instead of scattered villages and farm fields, they encountered a growing colonial city with stone buildings, warehouses and docks, filled with ships arriving from across the Atlantic world. Some migrants remained in Canada after arrival. Work could sometimes be found in construction, timber industries, or domestic service within expanding towns. Others travelled further inland along the St. Lawrence River towards settlements in Upper Canada. A large number, however, continued their journey toward the United States. Travel between Canada and the United States was relatively accessible during this period. Migrants could move south by boat or overland routes into American cities, where employment opportunities appeared more abundant. New York became one of the most important destinations for Irish migrants during the famine years. The harbour of New York City was already one of the busiest ports in the world, connecting trade routes from Europe, the Caribbean, and North America. When ships carrying Irish passengers entered this harbour, the newcomers saw a city filled with activity. Warehouses lined the waterfront, sailing vessels crowded the docks, streets near the harbour bustled with merchants, labourers, and travellers from many different countries. For migrants who had grown up in quiet rural districts, the scale of such cities could feel overwhelming. Upon arrival, many Irish migrants were processed through immigration facilities where officials recorded passenger lists and verified basic information about travellers. Unlike modern immigration systems, the procedures were relatively simple, but they helped authorities monitor the flow of arrivals. After disembarking from ships, migrants often gathered in boarding houses or temporary lodgings near the docks. Some had relatives or acquaintances waiting to greet them. Others relied on assistance from charitable organisations that helped newcomers adjust to life in the city. Irish communities that had formed during earlier decades of migration played an important role during this period. These established groups provided support networks for new arrivals, offering guidance about employment, housing, and local customs. Churches frequently served as important meeting places for these communities. Catholic parishes in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia welcomed newly arrived Irish families and helped connect them with local residents who shared their background. In many cases, the first jobs available to Irish migrants involved manual labour. Cities across North America were expanding rapidly during the mid-19th century. Roads, canals, railroads, and buildings required large numbers of workers. Irish labourers often found employment in construction projects that shaped the infrastructure of growing cities. Dock work also provided opportunities. Ports required workers to load and unload cargo from ships arriving with goods from around the world. For women arriving from Ireland, employment in domestic service was common. Households in urban areas frequently hired servants to assist with cooking, cleaning, and childcare. These positions offered modest wages and housing arrangements that helped newcomers establish themselves in their new environment. Despite the availability of work, life in immigrant neighbourhoods could be challenging. Housing conditions in rapidly growing cities were often crowded. Many migrants lived in tenement buildings where several families occupied small rooms within the same structure. Sanitation systems in these districts were limited, and urban poverty affected many residents. Yet within these neighbourhoods, Irish migrants began building communities that preserved elements of the culture they had carried across the ocean. Language patterns, religious practices, and social traditions helped maintain a sense of identity among families adapting to new surroundings. Music, storytelling, and gatherings within churches or community spaces reinforced connections between migrants who shared similar experiences. Letters written back to Ireland during this time described these new environments. Some migrants wrote about the opportunities they had found in American or Canadian cities. Others explained the difficulties they faced as they adjusted to unfamiliar working conditions and crowded urban life. These letters continued to influence decisions among families still living in Ireland. Reports of steady wages abroad encouraged additional migration during the late 1840s and early 1850s. Back in Ireland, the famine had not yet reached its conclusion. The countryside continued to face food shortages, population displacement, and economic disruption. For those who remained, the decision about whether to leave the country remained an ongoing question. Meanwhile, the Irish communities forming across the Atlantic slowly began to grow in size and influence. Neighbourhoods with strong Irish identities appeared in major cities. Churches expanded their congregations. Labourers contributed to building railroads, canals, and public works that transformed the landscape of North America. The migrants who had crossed the Atlantic during the early years of the famine were gradually becoming part of the societies where they had settled. The year of Black 47. By the beginning of 1847, the crisis that had begun with the failure of the potato harvest had entered its most severe phase. The previous year's crop had been almost entirely destroyed in many regions, leaving communities with little food stored for the winter months. Public works programs had expanded, workhouses were filled beyond their intended capacity, and relief organisations struggled to keep pace with the growing need. In Irish history, this period came to be known simply as Black 47. The name reflected the widespread hardship experienced across the country during that year, when the combined effects of hunger, disease, and economic disruption reached their highest intensity. The winter of 1846-1847 proved especially difficult for rural communities. The shortage of food from the failed harvest meant that many households entered the cold months with very limited supplies. In ordinary years, the potato pits stored near cottages would provide steady nourishment through the winter until the next planting season. During this year, those pits had been empty or filled with spoiled crops. Families relied heavily on whatever assistance relief systems could provide. Public works projects continued operating in many districts, though the physical demands of the labour remained difficult for individuals weakened by hunger. Wages earned through these programs were often used immediately to purchase food for families waiting at home. At the same time, workhouses continued receiving increasing numbers of people seeking shelter and meals. Administrators within these institutions faced enormous challenges as overcrowding became a common feature of daily life. Facilities designed for several hundred residents sometimes held far larger populations. The spread of disease added another layer of difficulty. When people gathered in crowded conditions with limited sanitation and weakened immune systems, illnesses could spread quickly. Diseases such as typhus, fever, and dysentery appeared in both rural communities and relief institutions. Medical knowledge during this period was limited compared to later generations. Doctors and nurses worked under difficult circumstances as they attempted to treat patients while managing the growing number of cases. As reports describing these conditions reached government offices and newspapers, relief efforts began shifting toward new approaches. One of the most significant changes during 1847 involved the introduction of large-scale soup kitchen programs. These kitchens distributed prepared meals to communities rather than relying entirely on employment programs or workhouse admission. Soup kitchens were established in towns and villages across Ireland, with support from government authorities and local committees. Large quantities of food were cooked in central locations and served to anyone in need. The system allowed relief workers to provide nourishment quickly to large numbers of people. For many families, the daily visit to a soup kitchen became a regular part of survival during the worst months of the famine. Lines often formed early in the day as residents waited with containers to collect portions of soup or porridge. Children frequently carried small pots or bowls for their households. Volunteers and workers within the kitchens prepared food in large cauldrons that could serve hundreds of people in a single day. Historical records suggest that millions of meals were distributed through these programs during the height of their operation. The soup kitchens helped stabilize conditions in many areas where food shortages had become severe. While relief programs expanded, the structure of rural society continued changing. The population in some districts began declining as migration increased. Families who had the means to travel left for ports where ships departed for Britain, Canada, or the United States. Others relocated within Ireland, moving from countryside farms to towns where relief systems were more accessible. These movements gradually reshaped the demographic landscape of the country. Parish records and local reports from the period show evidence of shrinking rural populations in several regions. Villages that had once supported large numbers of tenant farmers now contained fewer residents as families departed or relocated. Despite the severity of the crisis, the year 1847 also marked the beginning of certain improvements in food distribution systems. The soup kitchen network demonstrated that direct food assistance could reach large portions of the population quickly. In many communities, these programs provided a degree of stability that had been difficult to achieve earlier through employment-based relief alone. By the later months of the year, some agricultural conditions also began to shift. Farmers continued planting potatoes when possible, though many remained cautious about relying entirely on that crop again. Other forms of agriculture began receiving greater attention as communities considered ways to diversify food production. Even so, the impact of the famine years could not be easily reversed. The combination of crop failures, population displacement, and economic disruption had already altered the foundations of rural life. Many families who had once depended on small farms were now part of a broader migration that extended far beyond Ireland's shores. Across the Atlantic, Irish immigrant communities continued growing as new arrivals joined earlier migrants. Cities such as New York, Boston, and Montreal saw expanding neighbourhoods where Irish traditions, churches, and social networks developed. Meanwhile, in Ireland, the experience of Black 47 remained deeply embedded in the collective memory of communities that had endured the most difficult period of the famine. Although the worst conditions of that year would gradually ease, the consequences of the crisis continued unfolding in the years that followed. The migration that had begun during these desperate months would not end when the blight finally weakened. Instead, it would become a lasting movement that reshaped both Ireland and the many countries where Irish migrants settled. Labour, poverty, and new beginnings. As Irish migrants settled into cities and towns across North America and Britain, daily life quickly became centred around work. For most arrivals, the opportunity to earn regular wages was the most immediate difference between their new surroundings and the conditions they had left behind during the famine years. The expanding economies of the mid-19th century required large numbers of labourers. Cities were growing rapidly, transportation systems were expanding, and industrial development was reshaping urban landscapes. These changes created employment opportunities that migrants from Ireland began to fill in significant numbers. Many Irish men entered the field of manual labour, which required strength and endurance but offered steady income. Construction sites across American and Canadian cities relied heavily on immigrant workers. Streets were being paved, bridges were built over rivers, and new buildings appeared as commercial districts expanded. Railroads represented one of the most significant sources of employment. During the 1840s and 1850s, railway networks were spreading across the northeastern United States and parts of Canada. Irish labourers frequently worked on these projects, clearing land, laying track, and digging tunnels through rocky terrain. Railway construction required teams of workers who could perform physically demanding tasks over long periods. Although the work was difficult, it offered wages that allowed labourers to support themselves and sometimes send money back to relatives who remained in Ireland. Canal construction also provided employment during this period. Earlier projects, such as the Erie Canal in New York, had already demonstrated the importance of water transportation in connecting inland regions with coastal trade routes. Maintenance and expansion of these canals continued to employ large numbers of workers. Irish migrants also worked along docks and waterfronts in port cities. Ships arriving from across the Atlantic required crews of labourers to unload cargo and move goods through warehouses. These positions were often temporary or seasonal, but they provided income for men who were willing to perform heavy physical work. For women who had emigrated from Ireland, domestic service remained one of the most common forms of employment. Households in growing cities frequently hired servants to assist with cooking, cleaning, laundry, and childcare. Young women arriving from Ireland often entered these positions soon after reaching their destination. Employers provided room and board along with modest wages. Domestic service offered several advantages for newly arrived migrants. It required limited prior training, and the living arrangements reduced the immediate need to secure separate housing in crowded urban districts. Many women saved part of their earnings to help relatives travel abroad or to support family members already living in the city. Despite the availability of employment, poverty remained a common experience for many immigrant families during their early years abroad. Wages earned through manual labour or domestic service were often modest. At the same time, the cost of housing in rapidly growing cities could be high. Many migrants therefore lived in densely populated neighbourhoods where multiple families shared the same buildings. Tenement housing became a familiar feature of immigrant districts in cities like New York and Boston. These structures often contained several floors of small apartments or rooms arranged along narrow hallways. Limited ventilation and sanitation sometimes created unhealthy conditions. In these crowded environments, residents developed informal systems of cooperation. Neighbours helped care for children, while adults worked long hours. Food was occasionally shared during difficult weeks when wages were delayed or employment was interrupted. Mutual aid societies began appearing within Irish communities as a way to support workers facing illness or unemployment. Members contributed small amounts of money regularly to funds that could assist individuals during times of hardship. These organisations reflected the importance of community ties among migrants adjusting to unfamiliar environments. Churches continued to play an important role in daily life. Catholic parishes provided not only religious services, but also educational programs and charitable activities. Schools connected to these churches taught children of immigrant families basic literacy and practical skills that would help them navigate their new society. For many parents, education represented an opportunity for the next generation to pursue occupations beyond manual labour. Children of Irish migrants often attended parish schools during the week, while assisting their families through small jobs or household responsibilities. Over time, some moved into skilled trades, clerical work, or small businesses that offered greater stability. This gradual upward movement within urban society did not occur immediately. Many families spent years working in physically demanding jobs before achieving more secure economic positions. Yet the possibility of improvement remained an important motivation for migrants who had experienced the hardships of the famine years. Irish communities also began participating in the civic and political life of their new cities. Labour organisations occasionally included Irish workers who advocated for better wages and safer working conditions. Political groups sometimes attracted immigrant voters who were eager to influence decisions affecting their neighbourhoods. In cities such as New York, Irish migrants gradually became visible participants in municipal politics. Community leaders who had once arrived as labourers later emerged as organisers, business owners, or public officials. At the same time, cultural traditions continued shaping daily life within immigrant neighbourhoods. Music and dance remained popular forms of recreation. Gatherings in community halls or parish spaces often included traditional songs remembered from Ireland. These events offered moments of relaxation after long days of work and reinforced shared cultural identity among residents. Festivals connected to religious observances also brought communities together. Celebrations such as St. Patrick's Day became opportunities to express pride in Irish heritage while adapting to life in a new country. Through these activities, migrants maintained connections to their past while gradually building new identities shaped by their experiences abroad. Meanwhile, the situation in Ireland continued evolving. Although the worst years of the famine had passed by the late 1840s, the social and economic effects remained significant. Population levels had declined due to migration and mortality. Rural communities that once depended heavily on the potato crop were undergoing slow transformation. News of these changes continued reaching Irish communities overseas through letters and newspapers. For migrants who had left during the height of the famine, the distance between their new homes and the countryside of Ireland remained emotionally significant. Many continued sending money to relatives who remained behind, helping families rebuild or finance additional migration. In this way, the Irish diaspora became closely connected to the ongoing story of Ireland itself. The experiences of labour, poverty, and gradual progress that characterised immigrant life abroad formed one of the lasting legacies of the famine migration. For the individuals who crossed the Atlantic, the journey had begun as a response to crisis. Over time, however, it became the foundation for new communities that would influence the societies where they settled for generations to come. The famine's effect on Irish society. While Irish communities were slowly forming in cities across the Atlantic world, the island they had left behind was undergoing profound transformation. The famine years had disrupted nearly every aspect of rural life, and by the early 1850s, the structure of Irish society looked noticeably different from the one that had existed before the blight appeared in the potato fields. One of the most visible changes involved the size of the population itself. Before the famine began in 1845, Ireland's population had exceeded 8 million people. It had grown steadily throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, supported by the agricultural system that allowed families to survive on small plots of land. Potatoes had played a central role in sustaining that population growth. During the famine decade, however, the number of people living in Ireland began to decline sharply. Some of this decline resulted from the hardships of hunger and disease that had spread during the worst years of the crisis, yet a significant portion was the result of migration. Hundreds of thousands of people left the country during the late 1840s and early 1850s, seeking stability in Britain, Canada, the United States, and other destinations. Each departing ship carried individuals who might otherwise have remained part of Ireland's rural communities. Over time, the cumulative effect of these departures reshaped the demographic landscape of the island. Certain districts experienced particularly noticeable changes. In regions that had once supported dense populations of small tenant farms, the number of occupied cottages gradually decreased. Fields that had been divided among many families were sometimes consolidated into larger holdings. This shift in land use reflected broader changes in agriculture following the famine. Before the crisis, the agricultural system had supported many small farms focused on potato cultivation. After the famine, landlords and estate managers often reorganized land into larger units, more suitable for grazing livestock or diversified farming. These larger farms required fewer tenant families to operate. As a result, the structure of rural employment also evolved. Agricultural labour remained important, but opportunities for small-scale tenant farming became less common in some regions. Individuals who might once have worked their own small plots increasingly found employment as farm labourers on larger properties. These changes contributed to a gradual decline in the number of rural cottages scattered across certain landscapes. Visitors travelling through the countryside during the 1850s sometimes noted abandoned structures or fields that had been reconfigured into broader pastures. Alongside these economic adjustments, social life within villages also shifted. Many communities had lost a portion of their younger population to migration. Families who had once lived side by side for generations now saw relatives and neighbours departing for distant countries. Letters from abroad became important connections between those who had left and those who remained. Religious institutions continued playing a central role in maintaining community life. Churches and parish gatherings offered opportunities for people to share news, maintain traditions, and support one another during a period of adjustment. Schools also became more prominent in the years following the famine. Educational reforms gradually expanded access to basic literacy and arithmetic instruction, helping children prepare for a society that was slowly becoming more connected to broader economic and administrative systems. At the same time, cultural memory of the famine itself began taking shape. Families remembered the years of hardship through stories shared within households and communities. Personal experiences of hunger, migration, and survival became part of local history. These memories were passed down to younger generations who had not directly witnessed the worst years of the crisis. Songs, poems, and written accounts also contributed to preserving these memories. Writers and historians began documenting the events of the famine, attempting to understand both the causes of the disaster and its long-term consequences. Public discussion about the famine often included debates about responsibility and policy decisions made during the crisis. Political leaders, journalists, and scholars examined how government responses, agricultural practices, and economic structures had influenced the course of events. These discussions did not always produce agreement, but they reflected a growing effort to interpret the famine within the broader history of Ireland. Meanwhile, the Irish diaspora continued expanding overseas. The communities formed in North America and Britain remained closely connected to Ireland through family ties. Money sent from migrants abroad provided important support for relatives still living on the island. These financial contributions sometimes helped families rebuild farms, purchase land, or finance additional migration. As communication networks improved through expanding postal services and transatlantic shipping routes, the exchange of letters and news became more regular. For many Irish families, the relationship between homeland and diaspora became a defining feature of their lives during the 19th century. Back in Ireland, the experience of the famine had encouraged gradual changes in agricultural practice as well. Farmers became more cautious about relying entirely on a single crop. Greater attention was given to diversification, including the cultivation of grains and other food sources alongside potatoes. The potato itself did not disappear from Irish agriculture. It remained an important crop because of its productivity and nutritional value. However, farmers were more aware of the risks associated with monoculture and sought ways to reduce vulnerability to future crop failures. Infrastructure improvements also continued during the decades following the famine. Roads, railways, and communication systems expanded across the island, connecting rural districts more closely to towns and markets. These developments helped integrate Ireland into broader economic networks that linked it with Britain and international trade routes. By the early 1850s, the immediate emergency of the famine had begun to subside. Harvests gradually improved, and relief programs were reduced as food supplies stabilized. Yet the legacy of the crisis remained visible in both the physical and social landscape of the country. Population decline, altered land patterns, and the creation of a vast Irish diaspora ensured that the famine years would remain one of the most significant turning points in Ireland's history. Culture, memory, and loss. As the famine years gradually passed into history, the experience of those difficult seasons remained deeply present in the memories of families and communities across Ireland and the wider Irish world. The events of the late 1840s had reshaped the population, altered the countryside, and scattered millions of people across distant countries. Yet the emotional and cultural memory of the famine lived on in quieter ways, through stories, songs, and written accounts that preserved the experiences of that generation. In many rural households, the memory of the famine was carried through family narratives. Parents described to their children the seasons when the potato crop had failed, and the long months when food became scarce. These stories were often told simply and factually, focusing on the daily realities of survival rather than dramatic retellings. The memories included details of ordinary life during the crisis, the long walks to relief stations, the crowded rooms of workhouses, the gatherings around soup kitchens where neighbours waited together for meals. These recollections preserved the shared experience of communities that had endured the famine years side by side. Migration also shaped the way these memories travelled across generations. Letters written by emigrants during the 19th century often contained reflections on the conditions they had left behind in Ireland. Some writers described the hunger and uncertainty of the famine years before recounting the opportunities they found abroad. Others focused on maintaining connections with relatives who had remained in Ireland, exchanging news about family members and village life. These letters became valuable historical records that later generations used to understand the personal dimension of the famine migration. In addition to family correspondence, cultural expressions began capturing the experiences of the period. Traditional Irish music, which had long served as a way of preserving history and community identity, incorporated themes connected to migration and loss. Songs describing departure from Irish ports, memories of rural villages, and the uncertainty of life in distant countries became part of the repertoire performed in both Ireland and immigrant communities abroad. These songs did not always describe the famine directly, but they reflected the emotions associated with leaving home and adjusting to unfamiliar environments. Poetry and written literature also began addressing the events of the famine. Writers who lived through the period, as well as those who studied it later, attempted to record the circumstances that had led to such widespread disruption. Some authors focused on documenting the agricultural and political factors that contributed to the crisis. Others explored the human experiences of families who had endured hunger, displacement, and migration. Newspapers and pamphlets published during and after the famine years contributed to public discussion about the causes and consequences of the disaster. Journalists reported on relief programs, government debates, and the ongoing migration that was reshaping Irish society. These publications helped spread information not only within Ireland, but also among Irish communities overseas. For migrants living in cities across North America and Britain, cultural memory of the famine remained closely tied to the identity of their communities. Irish neighbourhoods abroad often maintained traditions that connected residents to their homeland. Religious celebrations, music gatherings, and storytelling events provided opportunities for migrants to share memories of the villages they had left behind. Churches served as important centres where these cultural connections could continue. Parish events brought together families who had travelled from similar regions of Ireland. Through these gatherings, younger generations who had been born abroad learned about the history of the famine and the journeys their parents or grandparents had undertaken. Over time, monuments and memorials began appearing in locations connected to the famine migration. In Ireland, communities established markers or commemorative sites in places where large numbers of people had departed during the crisis. Ports such as Cork or Dublin, which had witnessed the departure of thousands of migrants, became associated with the memory of those journeys. Across the Atlantic, Irish communities also recognised the significance of the famine migration. Memorials were erected in cities where large populations of Irish immigrants had settled. These monuments often served as reminders of both the hardship that had driven migration and the resilience of those who rebuilt their lives in new countries. Historical research during the late 19th and early 20th centuries further expanded public understanding of the famine. Scholars examined government records, agricultural reports, and personal accounts to piece together a clearer picture of what had occurred during those years. Their work helped place the famine within the broader context of Irish history and international economic systems. This research revealed how multiple factors had contributed to the crisis, including agricultural dependence on a single crop, land ownership patterns, and the political and economic policies of the time. While these studies provided valuable analysis, the emotional memory of the famine often remained rooted in personal experience. For many families, the story of the famine was not simply a historical event, but a defining chapter in their family history. The departure of ancestors from Ireland, the survival of difficult voyages, and the rebuilding of lives in distant cities all became part of the identity of the Irish diaspora. As generations passed, the direct memory of the famine slowly faded, yet the cultural legacy continued shaping how Irish history was understood and remembered. The famine migration had created one of the largest diasporas in the 19th century world. Irish communities established themselves across North America, Britain, Australia, and other regions. These communities maintained connections with Ireland while also influencing the societies where they settled. In this way, the memory of the famine became both a story of loss and a story of transformation. The countryside that had once supported millions of small tenant farmers had changed, and the people who left carried elements of Irish culture with them to new continents. Songs, letters, and family traditions ensured that the experiences of the famine generation would not disappear entirely from public awareness. Political consequences and nationalism. As Ireland moved further into the second half of the 19th century, the famine years continued influencing political discussion and national identity. The crisis had not only changed the demographic and economic structure of the country, it had also shaped how many people viewed the relationship between Ireland and the British government. During the famine itself, relief programs and economic policies had been organised under British administration. Decisions about food imports, public works programs, and the structure of relief were debated primarily within the British Parliament and implemented through government officials in Dublin Castle. While these policies had been intended to manage the crisis according to prevailing economic ideas, many Irish observers later questioned whether the response had been sufficient for the scale of hardship that occurred. In the years following the famine, public discussion increasingly reflected these concerns. Political writers, newspaper editors, and community leaders debated how the disaster had unfolded and what lessons might be drawn from it. Some commentators emphasised the vulnerability created by Ireland's agricultural system, particularly the reliance on the potato as the primary food source for much of the rural population. Others focused on land ownership patterns that had concentrated property in the hands of landlords while many tenant farmers worked small and insecure holdings. These debates became part of a broader conversation about Ireland's political future. Movements advocating greater Irish self-government had existed even before the famine. Organisations such as Daniel O'Connell's campaign for the repeal of the Act of Union earlier in the century had already raised questions about Ireland's relationship with Britain. After the famine, however, the tone and urgency of political discussions gradually evolved. Many Irish communities had experienced the famine directly through hunger, migration, or the loss of relatives. These experiences created a strong awareness of the social and economic structures that had shaped the crisis. As a result, public interest in political reform continued growing throughout the late 19th century. One important area of discussion involved land reform. Tenant farmers had long faced uncertainty because they did not own the land they cultivated. Rent payments and lease agreements could change depending on the decisions of landlords or estate managers. During the famine years, this system had contributed to widespread evictions when tenants could no longer meet financial obligations. In the decades that followed, political movements began advocating for changes to land ownership laws. Reformers argued that giving farmers more secure rights to the land they worked would reduce instability in rural communities. These efforts eventually led to a series of legislative reforms that gradually altered land ownership patterns across Ireland. Another development during the post-famine period involved the rise of new nationalist organisations. Some groups focused on constitutional methods of political change, seeking greater autonomy for Ireland within the framework of the United Kingdom. Others promoted more radical ideas about independence and national identity. The Irish diaspora played an important role in supporting these movements. Migrant communities in the United States and Britain maintained strong emotional connections to Ireland, and often contributed financial support to political organisations advocating reform. Irish American communities in particular became influential participants in discussions about Ireland's future. Newspapers published in immigrant neighbourhoods covered events in Ireland closely, and public meetings sometimes raised funds to support nationalist causes. Within Ireland itself, political activism took many forms. Public meetings, newspaper campaigns, and parliamentary debates addressed issues related to land rights, governance, and cultural identity. Political leaders emerged who sought to represent the interests of tenant farmers, urban workers, and other groups affected by economic change. At the same time, cultural movements began exploring the preservation of Irish traditions and language. Writers, scholars, and community organisations showed renewed interest in Gaelic language, folklore, and historical traditions that had long been part of Irish cultural life. These efforts contributed to what later became known as the Gaelic Revival, a movement dedicated to celebrating Irish heritage and identity. The famine years often appeared within these cultural discussions as a defining historical experience. The migration, hardship, and social transformation of that period shaped how many people understood the story of Ireland. Yet political change during the late 19th century developed gradually rather than suddenly. Reforms related to land ownership unfolded over several decades as governments introduced legislation addressing tenant rights and property transfer. These measures allowed many tenant farmers eventually to purchase the land they worked, creating a more stable agricultural system. Meanwhile, debates about self-government continued within British and Irish political institutions. Some leaders proposed forms of local autonomy that would allow Ireland greater control over its domestic affairs. Although these proposals faced significant opposition at times, they reflected the continuing influence of the political questions raised during and after the famine. For many Irish families, the connection between the famine and later political developments remained personal as well as historical. The migration that had begun during the crisis created a global Irish community whose members followed political events in their ancestral homeland closely. Letters, newspapers, and travel between countries maintained these connections across generations. As a result, the legacy of the famine extended beyond its immediate impact on agriculture and population. It also contributed to shaping the political conversations that influenced Ireland's path through the later 19th century. The countryside that had once depended heavily on small potato farms was gradually evolving into a society that combined agricultural reform, cultural revival, and growing political awareness. The Great Diaspora continues. By the early 1850s, the worst years of the famine had begun to fade, but the migration that it had set in motion did not come to an end. Instead, the movement of people away from Ireland continued for decades, becoming one of the defining demographic patterns of the 19th century. Even after harvests improved and relief systems were gradually withdrawn, many families still faced limited opportunities in the countryside. The agricultural structure that had supported millions before the famine had been altered significantly. Small tenant holdings had declined in number, larger farms had become more common, and employment opportunities in rural districts remained scarce. For younger generations growing up during the 1850s and 1860s, migration increasingly appeared as a normal part of life rather than an unusual response to crisis. Families who had relatives abroad often maintained active communication through letters. These letters described employment opportunities, living conditions, and the growing Irish communities that had formed in cities across North America, Britain, and other parts of the world. When news arrived that relatives had found stable work or purchased homes in distant cities, it encouraged additional family members to consider making the journey as well. Steamship travel gradually replaced many of the older sailing vessels used during the earliest famine migrations. Steam-powered ships shortened the time required to cross the Atlantic and offered somewhat more predictable schedules. What had once taken 6 or 7 weeks at sea could now be completed in a shorter and more reliable voyage. These improvements made migration more accessible and less uncertain. Ports in Ireland such as Cork, Dublin, and Queenstown, later known as Cobb, continued serving as major departure points for emigrants. Each year, ships carried thousands of passengers away from the island toward destinations that had already welcomed earlier migrants. In the United States, Irish communities continued expanding in cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. These cities were experiencing rapid industrial growth, creating a steady demand for labour in construction, manufacturing, and transportation. Irish immigrants became prominent participants in building the infrastructure of these cities. Roads, railways, and public buildings often relied on teams of workers that included large numbers of Irish labourers. Over time, some migrants moved beyond the crowded neighbourhoods near the docks and into developing districts within expanding urban areas. Families gradually improved their economic circumstances through steady employment and careful saving. In Canada, Irish migrants settled not only in major cities but also in rural communities, where agriculture remained an important part of local economies. Farming opportunities in certain regions attracted families who wished to return to agricultural life after leaving Ireland. Meanwhile, migration to Britain continued as well. Industrial cities such as Liverpool, Manchester, and Glasgow received many Irish migrants during the 19th century. These cities were undergoing major expansion due to the growth of factories and manufacturing industries. Irish labourers contributed significantly to the workforce that supported these industries. The movement of Irish migrants across the world gradually created what historians describe as the Irish diaspora, a global community of people connected by shared heritage and family history. This diaspora included millions of individuals whose parents or grandparents had left Ireland during the famine years or shortly afterward. Although they lived in different countries, many retained strong cultural connections to their ancestral homeland. These connections were maintained through traditions, religious practices, and community organisations. Irish festivals, music gatherings, and parish events helped preserve elements of cultural identity even among families who had been born abroad. Newspapers published in immigrant communities also played an important role in maintaining links with Ireland. Many cities with large Irish populations supported newspapers that reported on political developments and social changes occurring on the island. Readers in North America and Britain followed events in Ireland closely, particularly discussions related to land reform and political representation. Remittances sent by migrants also continued shaping life in Ireland. Money earned abroad was often sent back to relatives who remained in rural districts. These funds helped families improve housing, purchase land, or finance further migration for younger family members. In this way, the Irish diaspora remained closely connected to the economic life of Ireland itself. The ongoing flow of migration meant that Ireland's population continued declining throughout much of the 19th century. Census records from later decades showed that the number of residents on the island remained significantly lower than it had been before the famine. While some people eventually returned to Ireland after spending years abroad, the majority of emigrants built permanent lives in their new countries. Their children and grandchildren grew up speaking English with accents shaped by American, Canadian, or British cities. Yet family stories and cultural traditions often preserved the memory of Ireland as the place where earlier generations had begun their journey. The migration that began during the famine therefore became more than a temporary movement of people responding to a crisis. It developed into a long-term transformation of Irish society and global culture. Cities across the Atlantic world contained neighbourhoods where Irish heritage remained visible in church, architecture, street names, and annual celebrations. Political leaders, artists, and labour organisers with Irish ancestry would later play influential roles in the countries where their families had settled. Meanwhile, in Ireland itself, the effects of the famine migration remained evident in the quieter countryside and the changed population patterns that followed. The story of the Irish Potato Famine exodus had begun with the destruction of a crop in the damp fields of rural farms. Over time, it expanded into a worldwide movement of people whose descendants would continue shaping communities far from the villages where their ancestors had once lived. By the middle of the 19th century, the years of famine had gradually passed, yet the effects of the crisis continued shaping Ireland and the wider world in lasting ways. The failure of the potato harvest between 1845 and the early 1850s had begun as an agricultural disaster, but over time it became a turning point that reshaped population patterns, economic structures, and cultural identity. Ireland itself emerged from the famine years as a country that looked very different from the one that had existed before the blight appeared in the fields. The most immediate change was the decline in population. Before the famine, the island had supported more than 8 million people. After a decade marked by hunger, disease, and migration, that number had fallen significantly. Entire districts that had once been crowded with small farms and cottages now contained fewer families. This demographic change continued influencing Ireland's development for generations. Many rural communities adapted to the new agricultural landscape that followed the famine. Farms became larger in some regions, and livestock grazing gained greater importance within the rural economy. Farmers also became more cautious about relying entirely on a single crop. Although potatoes remained a valuable part of Irish agriculture, greater attention was given to crop diversity. Land ownership patterns also evolved during the decades that followed. Political debates that had intensified after the famine eventually produced reforms allowing tenant farmers to gain stronger rights to the land they cultivated. In time, many farmers were able to purchase their holdings, creating a more stable structure for rural communities. These changes did not occur quickly, but they gradually transformed the relationship between landowners and farmers across the island. Beyond Ireland itself, the most visible legacy of the famine appeared in the vast Irish diaspora that had formed during and after the crisis. Millions of people with Irish ancestry were now living in countries far from the villages where their families had once farmed small plots of land. Cities across the United States, Canada, Britain and Australia contain neighbourhoods where Irish traditions remained an important part of community life. In these new environments, Irish migrants and their descendants contributed to the development of modern societies. Labourers helped build the roads, railways, canals and buildings that supported expanding urban economies. Domestic workers maintained households in growing cities. Over time, later generations moved into skilled trades, business, education, and public service. Political participation also became an important aspect of Irish immigrant communities. In the United States, Irish Americans gradually gained influence within municipal and national politics. Leaders of Irish descent appeared in city governments and later in positions of national leadership. Similar patterns emerged in other countries where large Irish populations had settled. At the same time, cultural traditions continued linking these communities to their heritage. Religious institutions, particularly Catholic parishes, remained central gathering places where families celebrated shared traditions. Annual festivals, including St. Patrick's Day, evolved into public expressions of Irish identity that were celebrated not only by migrants, but by wider communities as well. Music, literature, and storytelling preserved elements of Irish culture that had travelled across the ocean with the famine generation. These traditions were passed down to children and grandchildren who had never seen the Irish countryside themselves, but understood its importance through family memory. The famine also became an enduring subject of historical study. Scholars, writers, and historians examined government records, agricultural data, and personal accounts to better understand how the crisis unfolded. Their research explored the agricultural vulnerability created by reliance on a single crop, the political context of 19th century governance, and the human experiences of those who endured the famine. These studies helped place the Irish famine within the broader history of global migration and economic change. The 19th century witnessed many migrations as people moved in search of opportunity or safety. The Irish exodus during the famine years stood out for its scale and its lasting cultural impact. Today, descendants of Irish migrants live across every continent. Many families trace their heritage back to ancestors who left Ireland during those difficult years when survival required courage and determination. The story of the famine exodus, therefore, belongs not only to Ireland, but also to the countries where Irish communities took root. In Ireland itself, memorials and historical sites remind visitors of the events that reshaped the nation. Ports that once saw the departure of emigrant ships now mark those journeys as part of the country's historical landscape. Museums and educational programs continue teaching new generations about the causes and consequences of the famine. Through these efforts, the lessons of that period remain part of Ireland's collective memory. The famine also encouraged reflection on the resilience of communities facing hardship. Families who endured hunger and uncertainty found ways to support one another through local cooperation, religious institutions, and relief programs. Migrants who crossed the Atlantic carried with them the determination to build new lives in unfamiliar places. Their experiences became part of the broader human story of migration and adaptation. Looking back across the years between 1845 and 1855, the Irish Potato Famine exodus appears as a moment when environmental conditions, economic structures, and political decisions converged to create one of the most significant migrations of the 19th century. What began with the quiet destruction of a crop ultimately reshaped nations and scattered millions of people across the world. The countryside of Ireland changed, but the cultural connections carried by its people continued to travel far beyond its shores. History often remembers great migrations through numbers and statistics, but behind those numbers were families who simply hoped to survive and find stability again. They walked away from small cottages, familiar fields, and villages where generations of their families had lived. They crossed oceans in search of places where work could be found, and where future harvests might not determine the fate of an entire household. Over time, many of those migrants built lives that were steady and secure. Their children grew up in cities far from Ireland's green countryside, speaking with new accents and learning new trades. Yet through songs, letters, and family stories, the memory of Ireland remained present in their lives. Back on the island itself, the land slowly recovered from the difficult years. Fields were planted again, villages adapted to changing conditions, and communities rebuilt their routines. The famine remained part of the past, but it also became part of a shared history that connected Ireland with the wider world. And now, as this story gently comes to a close, imagine the quiet Irish countryside at dusk. Stone cottages scattered across the hills, the distant sound of wind moving through grass, and the slow rhythm of rural life continuing as it has for generations. The people who once walked those fields may have travelled far away, but their story remains. And with that thought, it might be a good moment to rest.